So if I screw this up, just tell me and I'll try to follow instructions.
Joshua, it's really nice to see you too.
Ah,
And Steve as well. I don't know if you remember Steve, but we met years ago at the Sewanee Writers Conference. Yeah.
Well, hello.
Really just the same.
Hello. Here we are. Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Georgia Court, and from the chat that's been going back and forth between our poets this evening, I think we're going to have a lovely evening of a reading, in fact. As I say, I'm the proprietor of bookstore number 1 in Sarasota, and I love doing these Zoom chats because I get to see everybody's faces up close, and it's good to see new people in the room tonight. So welcome to all of you. Before I formally introduce our 2 speakers, though, I want to give you some information about some things that are happening at through the bookstore, both on Zoom, that I think you guys some of you might be very interested in. And one of them is an upcoming event on October 20th at 7 p.m. And that's, it's called Celebrating Elena Ferrante. Mm-hmm. And Elsie Souza, many of you know Elsie, who's our events manager. She's a wonderful interviewer. She's going to be live in discussion, in conversation with Ann Goldstein, who is the translator of all of Elena Ferrante's books, as well as Michael Reynolds, who is the editor-in-chief of Europa Publishing. So that's going to be October 20th. And if you're interested in that, I have put a link to it in the chat, where you could go to that link and RSVP for that event while you're here tonight. Another event that you all might be particularly interested in, it's a poetry event, and it's going to be November 6th. And it's with Herbert Woodward Martin. He's a poet, and he's a scholar of the work of Paul Laurence Dunbar. And he does an absolutely brilliant reading of Dunbar. And I expect he'll be doing quite a bit of that on November 6th. And once again, there's a link to that event in chat. So if that interests you, you can sign up for it while you're here. Also in chat, you will find the other links. Those are links to purchase books of Rick Hillis's books and Daniel Lawless's books. And there's a link to purchase Brother Salvage by Rick Hillis, Map of the Lost World by Rick Hillis, and The Gun My Sister Killed Herself With by Danny Lawless. So links to all of that are in your chat. Okay, now I'm going to introduce our 2 poets, and then I will turn it over to them. I will kind of disappear, and as you have questions or comments, please place them in the chat, because after their reading is over, I'll go to the chat to retrieve the questions, and occasionally we may ask some of you to unmute to follow up on your questions, but I'm going to leave you muted for right now, just so that in the back room, if your dog barks or somebody flushes something, we don't all get to hear it, which might disrupt the reading. Okay. Rick Hillis is the author of Brother Salvage, which is the winner of the 2005 Agnes Lynch Starrett Prize and named the 2006 Poetry Book of the Year by Forward Magazine. He's also the author of A Map of the Lost World, published in 2012, which was listed as a top pick on Library Journal's website. Among his honors are a Whiting Writers Award, the Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Scholarship, and fellowships from the Camargo Foundation in Cassis, France, the Stegner Program at Stanford, the Institute for Creative Writing at UW, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the Fulbright Program. His poems, translations, and essays have appeared in Boston Review, Harper's, Paris Review, and Poetry, among many others. He's currently working on 2 poetry manuscripts, a book-length poem called The Invisible Thread, portions of which have already appeared in significant journals, and The Empathy Machine, with individual poems from that collection having appeared in significant journals as well. He's an associate professor of English at Vanderbilt University, where he teaches all levels of poetry courses, including in the MFA program in creative writing. Also with us is Daniel Lawless. He's a professor of English at St. Petersburg College and is the creator and editor-in-chief of Plume, a journal of contemporary poetry. His book, The Gun My Sister Killed Herself With, was published by Salmon Poetry in 2018. His recent poems appear in the American Journal of Poetry, Plowshares, Prairie Schooner, and other journals. And some are forthcoming in Upstreet, To Horatio, and the Asheville Review. He's a 2018-2019 recipient of a Shifting Foundation grant and the founder and editor of Plume, a journal of contemporary poetry, Plume Editions, and the annual Plume Poetry Anthologies. So welcome to both of you, and I'm going to disappear and let you go. And as you're ready to wind down, give me a heads up, and I will come back in and take a look at what questions we have in the chat room. Have fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Yeah, first I'd just like to begin by thanking Georgia Court and Andrea Ginsky and everyone else at Bookstore One Sarasota for making this event possible. I do think, you know, in this particular time, like no other time in my life and probably your lives too, that supporting independent bookstores is just, you know, more important than ever. So, you know, it doesn't matter if you buy my book tonight or any of my books, but if you have a chance to buy some books from, you know, Bookstore One or if another independent bookstore near you that you've been meaning to support, please do so. Also, I just want to thank Danny Lawless too for, I think, putting the idea in my head first, and just lovely to get a chance to read with him. You know, while we're in a moment of gratitude, so today, October 16th, would have been this lovely man's 104th birthday. And this guy, Tadeusz Stapoltz, or I knew him as Ted, is just a wonderful storyteller, a Holocaust survivor that I got to know very well over a period of a decade, although I knew him actually growing up because he was just a physician for my family, but I didn't know about his sort of these harrowing stories. He had been in 7 different concentration camps, if you can believe that, during the Second World War. He was just an amazing storyteller, at least by the time I got to meet him. So I kind of wanted to think of this reading, at least for me, as a celebration of a friendship. There's so many kinds of love that I think make life particularly sweet, and, you know, just wanted to acknowledge that. But I guess too, I wanted to begin with a poem. I know at least one other person in the audience worked with this wonderful, wonderful teacher and poet, Lucy Brock-Bordeaux. One little note, this doesn't have a long preamble, but you can see an African mask I think it's to my right, it's to my right, maybe to your left. It's referenced in this poem. Hope it won't distract you to have it right there. I took on some of her, in tribute to her, I felt like I took on a little bit of her mode and a kind of deliciousness of diction and lexicon that I don't always do, but it felt right here. The poem is called The Perplexities of Time and Space at Last Explained, Eventually, Amid Rain Delays. I've cashed in my cathedral quiet for a few well-worn African drums and a Senegalese Punic mask that I was gifted, I believe, by oblivion. After talking with a magical friend over an ordinary dinner one night, then walking home alone in the bustle of midsummer urban darkness, I heard the sound of something. Had it been thrown from a passing car or fallen from a great height? Who can say? But picking it up, I saw a hand-carved face of an African woman at rest, the skin painted a ghostly white, the black carvings of her hair, an image that I learned only later. is meant to bring its bearer to the end of grief. Now that I have enjoyed its companionable silence for a whole year, I give it to you now, that you might know its living medicine, like a blank page preparing for the soul that will seek refuge on it. May you receive its bounty, inexhaustible as it is delicious. You, with your husky lounge singer voice, tongue-tied from twirling cherry stems into gift bows, with your immaculate tobacco mouth. I'm going to read a couple of poems that aren't new. Most of the poems are new. That one is pretty new, within just the last year and a half. I live in a music city, Nashville, but I can't tell you the last time I went to see live music, just given the circumstances. But I don't know about you, but when I think about music and you know, even some of the younger pleasures I had, like being in garage bands and, you know, turning up amplifiers at ungodly numbers. Well, they all go up to 10 unless you're watching Spinal Tap, right? Where they go up to 12 or maybe higher, 11 at least, yeah. Anyway, this poem is called Fender Strat with Wah-Wah, Fuzzbox, and Whammy Bar. Because I think really you need all of that to make it fun. All right. A smeared note swells and scatters like a voice inside a cave, tugging the vibrato till the sound divides like an egg yolk dropped in broth. Inside you now, swirling like a geyser trapped in earth before the whole thing blows apart. As if the spirit world will talk back the more you face the amp and lean into yourself. You think, there are so many ways to pray, this being, of course, another lining up of hands, a way to take the vagrant silence in yourself and make it deafening. Now it is the whole house breaking in the sound of surf, the echoes rattling the bookshelves, even without the sound. This is a bit of a story that has to do a little bit with Sarasota, but the first part of it doesn't. A number of years ago in 2007, fall of 2007, I had this really unusually marvelous opportunity to spend a semester in the former apartment where the poet James Merrill lived. Could you imagine? I mean, unbelievable, unreal. And in many ways, it looked like he had just left it, you know, even though I think he had passed away in 95 and this was 2007, but it was just an astonishing experience. But, you know, one day they were replacing the original refrigerator. And, you know, I think, you know, just to be helpful, I, you know, got a broom and dustpan to kind of clean up things. And I realized that there were words in the dust that I was putting into this little dustpan. And so I wrote this poem, and just within the last few years, I had a chance to go to Sarasota, and I was talking to Georgia. And, you know, I had mentioned James Merrill and his last partner who, you know, I knew that his name was Peter Hooten. And she said, Peter Hooten? He lives here. I know him. Would you like to meet him? This is the kind of person Georgia is. She's just like one of those magical people that you mention something and then she finds a way to make it happen. But so I met him and I showed him this poem and he said, I bought him those words. They were part of a magnetic poetry set. I guess it was the erotic edition. I didn't know that when I wrote this poem. This is called From 3 Words of a Magnetic Poetry Set Found Caked in Dirt Beneath James Merrill's Last Refrigerator. And the 3 words are crimson, ring, and touch. It's true, there is no substitute for touch, for the kiss that sets a world in motion. One caress is all it takes. Watch any nurse in a delivery ward. Each warm fingerprint is gift. Whole histories of the heart could be devoted to what passes in an instant. From the snow of old skin tumbling like dazed moths in a blizzard of sunlight, to what turns crimson when the lit red fuse passes from lip to tongue in a kiss first registered as shock, then recognized, taken in seen. As when your true love says, your lips, a kissable music, before nodding off, leaving your mouth that inflamed ripe monogram of oh, an unkissed wish, that tremor in your bones restored. The residue of touch, the lipstick crimson rings, a nutrient set spreading in an instant. Or at the promise of the touch to come, a single note struck in the choir of itself, when made to sing in us, is madrigal, a resonance of every clear perception of the world, even disappointment, which might otherwise make for a language cacophonous. But when such sound takes residence in us, the resonance instead becomes the love we can do least without, the color of a tapped black note, a surface shaped in pressure, fissure, fault of pigment, ink, a single stroke, hoisted in the rafters of the mind, which is just another way to know the origin of touch as curative. Being a little touch, clearly, is unavoidable, but like a constellation, reflected perfectly, then blurred in a waiting pool, stirred by hand, the silver rings turn crimson in a heart exposed, as if by touch alone, one person, one life might keep the world in motion. A number of years ago, almost 20 years ago, in 2002, 2003, if I can say it like that, I got to live in Poland for about 6 months in a Jesuit monastery, which was just astonishing, and got a chance to do some co-translating, which was a remarkable thing for me. I mean, I didn't have enough Polish, but the people I was working with, of course, were, quadrilingual at the very least, and could talk to me about what would be lost if we went a particular way with a translation. But, that's one thing. And then, of course, there's when you haven't used a language in a while and the way it may flee from you. So this is a poem called My Polish. My Polish. When I try to thank it, it shushes me, then illuminates my way to the exit. What little Polish I have likes me best when I'm trying harder to deserve it. Meanwhile, it will have none of my shenanigans, least of all my pocket phrase book sayings, even if those who have spoken her their whole lives sometimes encourage me with an, oh, your Polish is so good, when I simply say hi on a train. What little Polish I have knows better and elbows me in the ribs. Then she just laughs and laughs. Lately, she seems to prefer me when I'm at a perfect loss with her and have to ask her all kinds of questions. Then she looks me in the eye and seems to take a genuine interest. I fear, though, that I remain too eager for her ever to give me the key to her innermost rooms, so I might bask in her albums of Chopin and come to comprehend her great depths and secrets. Clearly, she reserves these intimacies for others who've earned her trust, her almost family, who have proven their fidelity to her over many years, if not decades. Even then, sometimes she needs more proof of loyalty. To hear them say a shibboleth I never had, Even without her password, still I pursue her sometimes like a lover who sees is having a beautiful future with her. I have to admit, it is unlikely. Yet sometimes, even now, that kind of seeing and love well up in me. I'm inclined to think my Polish, promiscuous as she is, encourages it. How else could she have survived those generations of occupation and partition? But for the many mouths that coveted her cigarette and pastry taste. Even now, the sudden whiff of wild mushrooms, maybe in an autumn broth, on a or a particularly gamey sausage, will bring her back, the way a smile on the Sphinx still trembles with the riddle of her great mysteries. I have just a couple of poems left. We were going to read for about 15 minutes each and then leave things open to a Q&A, if that sounds good to you all. I don't know about you, and I imagine there are a lot of writers in this audience. I found that I've needed to, practice, have a daily practice of writing, but often find myself praising things that I would never think to praise because I'm deliberately looking for the good in things that otherwise I might, just feel, devastated by, So this is a poem that kind of grew out of that exercise. It's called Misunderstanding. Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to read another one. This has some more verbal play in it than this one. Maybe I'll read it after. This is called To Disenchantment. So this more clearly illustrates the kind of thing that could never have praise attached to it. But sometimes this is the imaginative work we do to get through a moment, not like any other moment. To Disenchantment, I praise the hoax exposed, the sham in shambles, the huckster's smirk, and the illusionist's oops. And when a clown pie lands in the right face, I praise the scam that scrams, the jilted lover who disregards the teleprompters and clearly goes for broke as they cut to an infomercial. And I praise that I'm not even tempted to be sold, but if I were, please throw a very wet sock at me. I praise the sunset that moves behind a cloud and the grass that Whitman loved. Even if Joseph Brodsky was right, it is propaganda. Forgive me, Uncle Walt. I know that's not what you meant, but what for you was a uniform hieroglyphic is now a DDT refined tautology. I praise those who walk back others' tantrums, clearly lying when they say they were joking. And I even praise all nascent immune systems that need our germs to realize themselves, and bright ideas revealed in funhouse mirrors. I praise the delayed romance to drive up ratings, the shamelessly sleazy ad campaign, the easy to spot out rhetoric of church and state. I praise those who are equally unconvinced that we'll ever know what happened in our lifetimes. And I praise the unlovely fragrance it all exudes, revealing just enough for us to know ourselves. And I praise, almost, the evidence that never comes, all bunk defunct, and every ballyhooer removed. And I praise the lofty and mossy prognostications, and their equally lofty and mossy prognosticators. And I even salute the red-lit truth, which eludes me, especially when I seek it most, even if it exists as the song of an extinct bird to which nothing we've heard even compares, or conjures one iota of its allure or ecstatic majesty. And so I praise what at once raises my red flags. Even the cringeworthy salesmen's trust me, but I will honor the first man, woman, or child who approaches me without cunning or guile, or subterfuge of any kind to say something I've never heard before, even something about the grass, bringing it to me with both hands, asking, "Hey, mister, do you know what this is?" And I will praise how far we're willing to go to see the grass together as through a microscope, so that the fire in every cell in it ignites us too. I think I needed some coffee, and that was the closest equivalent I had verbally. This is called To Misunderstanding. On the radio today, a neurologist identified the most important capacity of the human brain as being its capacity to contemplate a self beyond the self. Even the interviewer was not so sure he understood what his guest just said when he asked the specialist to explain it all again. I was not sure how the man would make his point again. So with thousands, possibly tens of thousands, invisibly listening along with me, we all leaned in, like silence itself, to the radio voice who then told us all about the brain's plasticity. He had doubted it himself, he said, for many years, decades really. He'd heard a colleague assert the theory 30 years or so before. A crank, he said, who he knew now had been a visionary all along, and led him to the realization that he'd been wrong about all he'd known about the brain. Being able to see beyond one's earlier position, that point of view, was the key that freed him to reject each former hypothesis that he'd made. This was the brain at any age, making new connections, and to abandon old neural connections for new pathways seemed the very hallmark of consciousness and our humanity. But how many of us really see past a prior understanding and abandon it completely? This man of science moved me most when he finally admitted how wrong he'd been in every other hypothesis he'd made, moving unknowingly from error to error without a sense of progress is what made him become himself. Even if all our work seems like nothing but the sum of all our errors, it will have been good to share our work nevertheless. A life may fail to yield even one answer and still be well spent. I believe I have time for one more. This poem is called In the Book of Spells. In the book of old spells, some promising to bring rain, while others assure safe passage for our dead from here to whatever's next. I searched for words that might help us now, past curses that for others are the cures. Turning the page makes a crisp, bright sound. There's something in moving through this book alone that comforts as it gives goose flesh. So much power in one carefully constructed tome, and yet each recipe for transformation stares back silent as a gargoyle on a tomb. Even if I could cast a spell, what would I invoke? The cure might be far worse than the curse. Maybe this book is too powerful for anyone to own. The press was small and now is defunct. Like those who see the holy words of sacred texts transcribed on what they eat, now I see more in each seed that might be planted in the earth. Maybe the ancients saved their best magic, not for words, but for what comes to us when we are overtaken by the sight of a loved one and words fail us, or we fail them, when we are wrong in how we're being right and truth eludes us. And now I read of how some wishes were bound with twine or hair, one's own or of a lover, living or dead, and tied to stones, which were thrown to various bodies of water, where they traveled the current that carried them and dissolved. By now, the book says, we have washed ourselves so many times in the waters, holding the wishes of others, that the answers they sought still hover near us. Finally, I close the forbidden book and rise so I can stand where the answers already are. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. It's wonderful.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for being in Plume.
Oh my gosh, thank you for, I should have said the Polish poem, Danny beautifully took it, and my goodness, what a...
Yes.
Yourself, my goodness.
And I see some other people too. Joyce, thank you for being in Plume, and Jennifer, and Cynthia, and Jan. Have you been in Plume? Yes, yes. So thank you very much. Those are wonderful poems, and I knew I recognized one. I just read the Merrill poem about half an hour ago.
Oh.
It was fresh in my mind. It's a great, great poem. And I occasionally go back to Merrill. But one has to dip in sparingly to Merrill. There's a lot, it's pretty dense material, and you can do 2 or 3 and you have to.
It's very rich. It's like sometimes like dessert, like a confection.
It is, yes, yeah, okay. And I thought that I would start briefly by, the poems I'm going to read are rather death haunted, and I hope that isn't immediately you want to flee. But it's been a rough few years. My siblings were, each of them schizophrenics, and each of them has died recently. And they were diagnosed when I was quite young, so it was something I was familiar with and wrote quite a bit about. And they were wonderful people. And so there's some of that in here, but I hope distanced enough so there's not some sort of morbid sentimentality. That would be a terrible thing for them. So the first one I'll read is something that Fran Ritchie just took from Upstreet. And it's, and I was thinking I was going to read something else earlier, but then Rick, you mentioned the mask behind you. And this one's genesis was this little etched bird. Opens up and you put little keys, I suppose, or things in it, but, and that's the name of the poem. It's called Etched Pewter Bird. Etched pewter bird, you who are empty and so neither desire the expensive organic feed mix or require the attentions of the fastidious vet, who do not cheep so psychotically cheerfully that sometimes I want to throttle you. You who do not retreat coyly from my outstretched hand or tremble wildly if I hold you. Who never once perched spitefully in the branches of the thorny locust tree behind the garage after I left your cage door ajar in summer, or in other seasons, mockingly eluded my ridiculous broom. You who fix your Aventine eye indifferently upon me at all times, unlike real birds who, if they regard me at all, regard me suspiciously or skeptically and keep their distance as they are tourists guarding their passports. You, in other words, little generic etched pewter bird on my desk, who should signify nothing at all to me, in fact, except from across the country, the news arrived not 8 hours ago, this windless December night, that my oldest friend in the world is dead, and there isn't anything she or I can do about that. And my heart, oh my stunned heart, on its couple of ribs is cold now as your weather-vane double, nameless, hollow, not hawk or sparrow. Terribly morbid, I'm afraid. This is a poem. The next ones are, this is not a death poem. This is good. This one's called Boyhood, long before yours, Rick, but you may recognize something here. It's called Boyhood. And now we come to the poem of the great mystery of the years 1957 to 1963. As you can see, it's a short poem with just enough room for the apple core I broke my front tooth on, one of Mary Kay Johnson's pigtails, an invisible photograph of my brother waving through the iron gates of a sanitarium. a King Edward cigar box of a poem, let's say, where emptied of its jackknife, centime, and wax lips, a parakeet might face eternity serenely nestled in a wad of Kleenex. Or maybe even a shed-sized poem, the dank, mysterious one with jars of rusted nails and coiled hoses behind the garden, where I'd like to pretend I was flying down a long Swiss mountain road in my father's flat-tired Schwinn, propped between two ancient suitcases. Yes, that's the ticket, a shed-sized poem. Nails, hoses, my dad's cobweb bicycle, and I, whistling through a missing incisor, ringing somewhere in the alpine air of the years 1957 to 1963, the bright silver bell of its title. So, Boyhood. An idyllic time in the 50s. The next two are starting a series, and I don't know about you guys, but once it's so nice to have a project, particularly in these times. One of the projects I have is breaking in a new cat, and she's been reluctant to. She was a rescue, so that's a nice project to have. But in poetry, I find having a little form is a wonderful thing for me. It's a little box I can get started with. And I've done a series called Definitions. Well, I'll take a word and kind of play around with it and see where it goes. So I'll read a couple of those, and we'll see how that goes. People are kind of liking them, I guess. So we'll see. We'll see. This is called Aglet. And does everyone know? You don't tell me, but do you know what an aglet is? I had forgotten, but I will tell you now. You will learn if you didn't know before. Aglet, from Definitions: a bloodletting tool, a vestigial claw, a liturgical vestment, a kind of stitch or stenographical notation, a vase, a fresh-born eel. It's fun now to imagine it could be any of these, but in 1967, the right answer was the little sheath at the end of a shoelace. Da's nightly vocabulary quiz, home from the Clifton cab yard, the summer before Sean and I would try for posh St. Tim's. So long ago now, but I can still see it. His press shirt and flocked cap, that pipe he claimed the mayor himself had given him. The two of us watching a drop of spittle trickle the length of its lacquered stem as he continued, from the old French, aiguille, needle, to point or pierce, colloquially a small sorrow. And the next one is I think I must have come across this in a newspaper, this article, and changed the names a bit, but John Scoyles and I have been talking about this kind of thing. He has a great book called The Nutcase. And it's from the German, Freudenschreck is the title, Freudenschreck. And Freudenschreck, or intense pleasure fright. Leave it to the Germans to coin a word for the fleeting sense of being seized by such an inexplicable joy, it verges on terror. Or maybe it's inexplicable terror pretending to be joy. Also, a physical phenomenon. Neurologists say the amygdala glows red as a jackball, whether the subjects gaze at images of placentimals or gallows. Picture a joyride, the Appalachian pin brides of Eugene Meatyard. Put yourself in the shoes of Iana Clemens, 44, of Peru, Indiana, a longtime congregant of the Endes Christian Church, according to the Gazette, who may have had a seizure that caused her to shiver all over. Although another passerby reported hearing her shout, "Praise him," or "Praise God," before she sort of rocked him, before casting that beautiful child into that cold river. One more little death poem, and then I promise it'll be over. And this one's called Since You Died, Em, and it's for my sister. Since you died, Em, untethered, maybe, is the metaphor I'm looking for. As in the bright orange leather ball swing on the pole today in the park, before some big kid smacked it too hard and sent it sailing into the parking lot. Or maybe the thin rope it hung from, frayed at the end. Or maybe unhinged, not crazy, but think of a door, the one the hurricane kicked in, how it never swung right after. I'm talking grief, Em, great rumbling red square tanks of it. Or maybe think of the grosbeaks gorging in the last of the black striped sunflower seeds at your beloved feeder. The black fluster of wings far before the hard crack, before the getting at the soft meat beneath. Okay, so enough of that for the moment. Two more, I think 3 more, and we'll be done, I promise. This one is about my mom. And Irish, came to the country early on. It's about that immigrant experience. And it's a real bink, bink, bink sort of musically poem, which I don't often write, but it's called Milady. It was a word that she used quite often. Milady, she'd say, Ma's liquored up catch-all address to her every imagined American better. One day a 4 roses la-ti-da, mocking feckin' gale storm in that get-up on Dinah Shore. Another a poisoned dart aimed at her big shot employer, Mr. Phillips's new Texas bride B, yee-hawing a jelly glass gin pretend martini and lumbering the cha-cha as she boiled the green out of Thursday cabbage. Mostly I'd just stare. And then she'd sort of cry and distant sweet, and you get the picture. This was in the late 50s, when recent Irish immigrant domestics like her must have been already tangled up in their lives, their haplessness and fearsome Catholic shame. Ma's wasn't the only one either. Sometimes in daydreams, I can hear them. Milady from Huge Delia bellowed at a blonde majorette. Addled Maggie spat at a red-faced whack as all the downtown maids traipsed along a VE Day parade through Louisville's Central Park, pissed on pursed bottles of Classic Club. Call it jealousy or a class thing if you want, but that night, Ma said she slept better than she had in years. Breakfast late, Lucky's and tea, daw at the pins. Milady later still, as I passed by the parlor, snarled once to the dust-specked mirror before she sort of curtsied, before I just stared at her packing up, before she left us for good for Galway by nightfall. And I'll do, let's see, kind of my first encounter with poetry was in the Louisville Free Public Library at, I don't know, maybe 16 or so. And I was figuring out, I taught myself a little bit of French through some book called French for Reading Knowledge, which I think is still around. And I had discovered on somehow, this had to be in 1972 or so, when you could go into the library and walk out with 6 books under your coat and there was no one to check you and that sort of thing. And I remember cigarettes, people smoking, there were cigarette burns in the carpet. It was a nice time, but somehow I discovered the Surrealists. I think the Binghams, who owned the Louisville Courier Journal, probably were, I know they were Francophiles and probably donated most of them, but not one had ever been checked out. So I had them all to myself. And I read Breton and everybody else. And I thought, my God, what is this? And it changed my life, really, 16 or 17. And so this one is, now I'm living in Florida, in St. Petersburg, and we have the mangroves all along the beaches. And so this is about mangroves and unfortunately what was found there. But I don't know that that's as important as it really is one of those list poems that the surrealists like so much, of images. And so that's where we are with this one. It's called Down in the Mangroves. Down in the mangroves, there's a pelican standing on one leg like a burnt out light bulb. And the low voice of a man, like a far off train reflected in ditch water. The sounds of cars on the highway, a bear with its head caught in a bucket. There's a suitcase with a little girl's body inside. The feeling of having forgotten something at the store is mostly what the soul is, right? The bare patch rubbed raw on a cat's paw? For some, that's the soul too, maybe the killer's. His hands are like two famous brothers who hate each other. His days flap open like the coat of someone running, days like lost dogs. There's a pink condom and a hair weave, like symbols in a Renaissance painting, and one of those red rubber coin purses like the mouth on Senor Wentz's hand. When a breeze fills up a plastic bag, it's like the stupefied face of a puppet in a jack-in-the-box. There's the smell of meat smoke from a barbecue like a lampshade with a red nightgown thrown over it. Also a bleached green button and a sunglass lens, perfectly round, side by side, like a double sun rising above an airless planet on the cover of an old-fashioned science fiction novel. In the distance, there's the squawking of seagulls, bitter to the ear, like the taste of aspirin. There's a manatee out there too, like a prehistoric baby. There's the sky, like the pleathered flesh of a dolphin, and the invisible presence of the stars together with their constellations that form sea monsters, peacocks, and carpenters' levels, along with the yet to be discovered outlines of iPhones and the visages of pop stars and butchers. When the waves retreat, there is the trembling of thousands of seashells, like the silence in a hallway where someone's just finished hollering. There's a can of peaches that looks right at you. Its top is open. There's a knife with a plastic handle sticking out, white like the smell of Christmas ornaments kept in a box. If you think she's like the last peach, deliquescing in its juices, that's on you. And the last one is, you would think that it is a terrible death poem, but it's really kind of not so bad in the end. It's called, On the Way to Your Funeral, Already Sleep Deprived. And it ends up kind of, it's a trip I took to obviously attend the funeral of a friend on a train, took a train to the funeral and read the poem. On the slow overnight train from Chicago to Altoona, after people had settled down, having hoisted their heavy bags onto the overhead rack and unfurled a magazine or unwrapped a tired muffin or iffy-looking chicken salad sandwich, I heard somewhere a few hours up a kid swear, no, it was a real live corpse. Pretty funny, but an image that stayed with me all the way to Toledo. As I gazed at my haggard face through the window in the growing dark, were cows and trees and stop signs, and here and there, an unmoored trailer floated by, as if a dim river had overrun its banks, as if I were already thinking of them in the afterlife. Or in a more Zen or theoretical sense, as if when I let my brow fall against the cold glass, my own face disappearing, the cows and trees and stop signs and occasional double wide had become my thoughts alone, disembodied, drifting out from the Ohio countryside into the vast, unknowable universe. An image that inevitably vanished, as despite the grinding of the heavy wheels and the screeching of the air brakes, I took a little nap, then got up to massage my aching thighs and use the bathroom, which is pretty much where I'd like to leave you, Robert. opening the thin little door, the majestic yawn, to find everyone silently gathering up their things in the half-lit car. The kids rubbing your eyes as you wipe your hands on a crisp white handkerchief. As the porter with his gleaming silver cart comes rattling down the aisle with his fresh Times for sale and steaming croissant. The tiny bubbles of Perrier rising in their tinkling green bottles as the voice on the loudspeaker announces Altoona. Next stop, Altoona, as if it were heaven itself, your hometown. That's it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Well, thank you. And I have just asked everyone to unmute. And the reason I've done that is that I wasn't seeing questions come through the chat, but I kept seeing chat come through the chat. And it looks to me like people just want to talk to you and comment. So I think I sent an invitation to everybody to unmute. So I would say go ahead and do that, at least if you're interested in talking with our poets. And anyone who wants to maybe put your hand up, because I can see you all now, and see who wants to go first.
No pressure.
No, no. Okay.
This is always the first moment, you know, do we make out? What do we do?
What, right. Well, I've got a question for you all, just to get it started. I was really taken with Rick's poem that to me was very clearly about the political moment, the one about the hoaxes and nascent germs and so forth. And for both of you, I'm just very curious. Have you all been inspired or the opposite by the current political situation to write poetry?
Would you like to go first, or shall I? Okay, then. It's both, isn't it? You know, it's like you feel the attack on the immune system constantly, and there's the hope that we're building enough antibodies to withstand it always. But then, I don't know, I would imagine there's so many writers and poets, artists in the group that I admire and treasure. And I imagine you all have versions of these answers, perhaps. But maybe, I mean, I do hope it's bolstering, not only to have a moment like this together, which for me, like, oh my God, this is going to be food for a long time, you know. But yeah, no, I think it's both. And, you know, I have to practice a lot of sort of limiting my exposure to certain news and certain outlets. Like I'll check in with the New York Times, I'll check in with the BBC, you know, and only so far, you know. But at the same time, I guess if we can turn it around, you know, and make it a source of life rather than a source of oblivion, then I think we're onto something, you know. And I do feel like the work we do, not too long ago, I rented this film, The Last Dalai Lama, with these beautiful interviews with the Dalai Lama. And he was talking about, you know, doing, I don't know if he would use the word prayer, forgive me for not feeling a little uncomfortable using prayer with his practice, but it's certainly a meditative practice, and talking about meditating for those, you know, who've put him into exile. And I think the interviewer was like, well, does it help? And he laughed in that amazing way and said, it helps me, you know. And I do feel like this practice that we do, it helps us all individually in ways that are not always visible, and, you know, and yet it gets us this far. And I hope it keeps getting us as far as we need to get to the end of this nightmare, you know? Was that enough? Was that too much? I don't know.
Yeah, I tend not to write specifically about the pandemic, although I have a couple of things in some places that do address it. But I, like you say, Rick, I think just the act of writing, of making art of any sort, is developing antibodies. So I see a lot as an editor of Plume, you know, I look at Submittable and there are hundreds of these things, and people sometimes do overly, I think, explicitly address the topic, which is maybe not the best way to go. But I don't know that I would be knock wood, as healthy as I am at the moment, without, at least mentally healthy, psychically healthy, without reading and poetry. Yeah, it's been great. It's been a real savior, as it has been most of my life.
Danny, may I ask you a question?
Mm.
Yeah. When did you start editing? I would imagine you had other editorial lives before Plume.
Not at all.
Not at all.
No, but yeah, it's a little silly. The origin story, I was teaching creative writing at my college, and a student in the back was apparently not paying attention, I assume. And so I kind of walked back there and figuring I'd catch him looking at something illicit. And it turns out this was 10 years ago, creating his own poetry journal online. And I thought, damn, maybe I can do that. So I invited him back to my office and said, you want to show me how you did that? And then we spent a couple of weeks at Starbucks, and I wrote probably 20 solicitation letters to poets I admired. And I swear within a day, probably 18 had said yes.
Wow, wow.
One within 10 minutes. Yeah. And I don't know why. It must have been a really good, I wish I could duplicate that solicitation letter.
Well, were those poets who you knew personally, or just poets you happened, were those poets that you knew personally?
No, not at all. Cold call, just who I'd been reading over the years, and said, look, I really like your work, particularly this and this. And boom, they were just so kind. And it's been, I originally had thought, okay, if I get one issue out of 12 poems, call it a day, victorious. Mm-hmm. And somehow it worked. It's kind of silly. It's surprising to me.
It's remarkable, the momentum that was started. I mean, it's a marvelous journal and I think a treasure. So I hope you.
Thank you. A complete surprise to me.
Other comments out there? Yeah, I see Lisa has
I have a question for both of you. I've known Rick for a long time. I'm new to Daniel's work, but it seems like such a wonderful pairing. I don't know if we have Georgia exclusively to thank for that. But so my question to both of you poets is just how, I don't know how familiar you are with each other as people and with each other's work, but how reading together shaped your set list for today. And just, your relationship to your own work, which I find changes every time I share work,
Mm-hmm. That's a beautiful question. Yeah, I'm happy to just leap right in, if you like, Danny. Danny and I are newly acquainted. I mean, this is the first time we've, met sort of face-to-face, well, in this kind of face-to-face way. We've corresponded with one another. I don't think I was in the first wave, but I was in a later wave of that glorious email. And I don't think I responded. I didn't have anything at the time. And then I wrote back saying, hi, you sent me this really beautiful email. Is it still true? Is it still okay? Could I still send something? And Danny said, sure. And I sent him some work. And I really have to say that I hear from older writer friends about this golden age of editing, and I think it's a very precious thing that I don't know it. I know it in sort of smaller doses, maybe as we do, collectively. But Danny really impressed me as just like few other editors I've known, to be so on it and to be so like considering the work rapidly and, getting back with, even like acceptances in just no time at all. And so we had a lovely correspondence, before this meeting. And, I was reading Danny's book, which is heartbreaking. And, we haven't had a chance to talk to this sort of subject, but we share a shadow, or we share a darkness. And although my sister very fortunately was unsuccessful, and she didn't try in the way your sister did, but about a week after 9/11 had tried with ibuprofen. It was like terrible. on your liver, apparently. You know,
Yes.
people often take an overdose and they'll be fine for maybe even a day, and then the liver just tanks and people usually die of that. But anyway, so, you know, it's a weirder maybe answer to the question, but I think sometimes there can be these affinities that are there, you know, for all kinds of reasons. You know, before you logged on, Danny and I were like, you seem to like to write story poems or narrative poems, and we do share that for sure, you know. So some of it was kismet.
That's what I was going to, the very word I was going to use. Yes. It does work out that way sometimes, doesn't it? And that's how sometimes issues of Plume come out that are people I didn't know, and I'll juggle around poems. And, you know, the book, The Library at Night by Miguel, great book. And he talks about books calling to one another, as Borges does, and others. But yeah, there's a great book, The Library at Night. He talks about books on his shelves. He leaves in the evening and they talk to one another. And sometimes that's what I try for, at least in the issue. Each issue is that poems kind of rub against one another, jostle, argue. But somehow there's a neighborhood that they all live in, each issue. It's a different neighborhood each time, I hope. But never an explicit theme, just sort of, yeah. As Cynthia well knows. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi. I'm thrilled to see you and to have heard you. I can't even tell you. I'm over the moon right now. Just wrote a question that was this long, so it's for both of you. And God, I could kiss the screen. Well,
would you, Cynthia, would you like to, it is a long question, but would you like to pose it in your own voice?
Well, if you'd like me to,
Of course, of course.
Sure. All right, here we go. Let's see here. What do I chat? Is it in the chat section?
It's the chat. Would you like me to read it if you can't find it? Or
I see it right here.
Okay, good.
Okay. All right. This is from me to everyone, but of course it's pretty much directed at Rick and Danny. And it says, please indulge me with making a personal comment to Danny. It is a great gift to me to see you and hear you read your glorious poetry. A question I would like to put to both of our distinguished poets is, when you feel you have a fully finished piece and you are even pleased with it, in its current final draft, do you return to it and address it with a very critical editing eye, honing it down further to a purer essence? How do you approach this technique, and where do you start with a particular line as an example? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That sounds like right up your alley, Rick.
I'm happy to be the crash test dummy. I will just leap right in. You know, it's funny. I mean, I was reading from, you know, poems from published books where I'm still changing words at the reading. I ran away for a second just to show you something that is something I treasure. The kind of thing we could do in an actual reading. And so I kind of love Zoom. So a number of years ago, I was living in San Francisco, and I found this book, Questions of Travel by Elizabeth Bishop. And it was $4.50. And it was signed, and, you know, oh my God, you know,
wow,
1968 San Francisco.
Yeah,
Wow.
From your fragile boned friend Elizabeth, and apparently she was drinking quite a bit then, and had fallen down the stairs and broke one leg, and then as soon as it healed, fell down the stairs again and broke the other leg. But none of that is what I wanted to tell you. What I wanted to show you is this. You know, like these little moments where she's crossed out things, that lovely woman, Elizabeth Bishop.
And that's after the book was published. Yes.
Yeah. And I believe in that life of the poem, you know, and even, it's interesting too. I don't know if we talk enough about how the attention that you supply bears down and help shape something. You know, like it's collaborative in ways that are that are indelible and utterly lovely, you know, but also unique to this experience and this kind of group of people, you know. That makes sense. I don't know. I hope that came close to answering your question, because I do think, you know, these, at least in my experience of poem writing poems, that you know, you can find a new way of saying something, and it can kind of happen extemporaneously when you're reading, you know. Danny?
There's the French phrase, esprit d'escalier, you know, it's always, you think of the best word just as you've gotten off the escalator. And so, yes, exactly so, that I see things in books, I go, oh, and that extends to, as I'm running, I'm listening to Dylan or somebody, and I think, oh, no, well, here's the word you should have used, even to Dylan, you know, I'm editing Dylan, really. So yeah, it's an ingrained habit, and I hate to let go. I'm astonished by people who are so productive. They'll do 8, 10, 20 books. I think, yeah, I can do that. I can produce that in 4 lifetimes. I mean, if I get 3 poems, and if I get a poem a month, I'm ecstatic. So no, and I don't let it go. And I have a version. I think, okay, that's done. Boom, done. Inevitably, I will go back and change something, and the poem becomes something else. Until finally somebody takes it from and will ask for a poem, and it's gone, and then there's no longer anything I can do about it.
Well, but what about if between the poem being gone and say at a journal, out there in the journal, and then prior to going into the book itself, you know, which is then the serious tome, right? Do you then ever make any adjustments there?
Yes, up until the last moment that I we've talked about up until the very last moment.
So yeah. We all do, don't we?
Don't we all? Yes, I think. And the trick is to make it look like you didn't.
Yeah, so true.
I mean, you read Frank O'Hara, oh, he just knocked these out as he's walking down 42nd Street. No, not really.
Exactly. I suppose there's a line, you know, I think all of this seems within the realm of of the normal and the totally fine. But, you know, if you find yourself with the Norton Anthology of Poetry and you're editing every poem, checking yourself into, you know, a hospital for a break.
Now, I thought, by the way, I just want to let you know, Lisa put a link onto the chat if you're interested. And she said, since empathy and neuroplasticity were mentioned, here's a link that might be of interest. It's monologist Josh Kornbluth's most recent series, Citizen Brain. And there's a link to that. So that's just want to call your attention to that.
Thank you.
Interested in that.
Oh, lovely.
Are there other questions? I thought that Joshua was raising his hand and he was there, and then maybe he's disappeared. So anyone else want to say anything, make a comment?
I see that Dee Dee and Major are here, and thank you for coming. It was very nice. I think I know a few others, but yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's very, very much a treat.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Danny. Thank you all for participating. Let's give them a big hand.
You guys.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Georgia, that was really wonderful. Very kind.
And Danny, just one comment. You mentioned the word the neighborhood of poetry. I think
yes.
I love that, and I think we were all in that wonderful neighborhood tonight, and it was nice to be together here. Even if we couldn't stand out on the street and cook brats or anything together. Thank you all.
It was very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Be well.
Be well.